I know that all of you are trying to get caught up with things happening at work, but we're going to get behind schedule a little bit, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. This afternoon's session is given by two great individuals that agreed to join us, and then had some complications with their system that prevented them from traveling, so we agreed to give them a Zoom opportunity because their message is great. I'd like to introduce the two speakers that we have. First is Dr. Anthony Munroe, who is the president of the Borough of Manhattan Community College. Dr. Munroe is an international expert on cultural competency and disparities in healthcare, and was named one of the top 25 minority healthcare executives in the United States by Modern Healthcare magazine. He serves on the board of directors of the Council for Higher Education Accreditation and on the Commission on Student Success with the American Association of Community Colleges. He was recently named the winner of the 2020 Phi Theta Kappa Honor Society's Paragon Award for New Presidents, which recognizes college presidents who have shown strong support for student success at their schools. Dr. Munroe holds a doctorate in education from Columbia University Teachers College with a concentration in health education. Let's give Anthony a round of applause. And Anthony, if you'll say something, the camera will go to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you all, albeit virtually. Thank you for the invitation and to allow us to just share a little bit about BMCC and our journey.
Thank you. Let's give him a round of applause and welcome him. Dr. Chris Shults is the Dean of Institutional Effectiveness and Strategic Planning for the Borough of Manhattan Community College. In this role as Dean of BMCC, Dr. Shults chaired the strategic planning process that resulted in their 2025 strategic plan, taking what works to scale, which was the culminating activity of the college's intentional redesign work as an AACC Guided Pathways college. He was the lead associate author for Managing the Big Picture in Colleges and Universities, Moving from Tactics to Strategy, which won the 2006 Alice Beeman Award for Published Scholarship from the Council for Advancement and Support of Education, and his most recent publication, Reinventing the Community College Business Model, Designing Colleges for Organizational Success, challenges community colleges to intentionally redesign for student success. Dr. Shults holds both the doctorate in higher education administration with an organizational behavioral management concentration from the University of Michigan. I think you're going to find this conversation to fit real well with what we've already heard today, and especially from our last keynote. So again, would you welcome Dr. Shults and Dr. Munroe. And Tony, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jay, and thank you all for taking the time out of your conference schedule to sit and listen to just a little bit of what we're going to share in regard to BMCC's journey as we focus on our students. As we all are so passionate about the success of our students, we know that there are so many forces that impact our ability to deliver on that promise. Forces that are in our control, some that are outside of our control. Clearly, the disruption that has been caused by this pandemic, changes in national policy, the shifts, and in some cases dramatic shifts in demographics, social justice issues, economic pressures have all caused us to ask the question, who are we? What are we? Why are we doing what we're doing? Are we truly fulfilling our institution's mission as we focus on our students? And we believe at BMCC very, very firmly that it's about the students first. And so we start and we end with our mission and our vision. And Dr. Shults is going to walk us through the next couple of slides, and then we'll get into the rest of our presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Munroe. So what I've done is I've placed the mission and the vision onto the screen. Both of these are either revised or new. The mission statement as part of the strategic planning process was revised, and we developed a vision statement for the first time. And I can say that part of our intentional process and part of what I would recommend for all institutions of higher ed, especially community colleges, to do is to involve as many individuals in the actual development phase of this kind of work. And so we had more than 1,000 individuals through the Guided Pathways 2.0 and our strategic planning work directly involved. What you see in red are the things that we are really focused on as an institution right now. And I don't mean focused on as in just what are we doing, but is it working? We're going through intensive levels of predictive modeling and conversations with our students and with our community and our external stakeholders to really better understand who we are and how well we're serving our communities. So, equity is a big part of it. We now have a race and equity inclusion steering committee that reports to the president and provides recommendations for the college. That is an incredibly helpful body, and one that is diverse and is looking at policy, practice, and structure, all of these things that are part of what needs to be at the core of our business model. You also see that there are the outcomes, the degree completion, successful transfer, but within our vision also who we want to be. When I help colleges, including BMCC, go through the process of developing a vision statement, the question that I ask, half jokingly, is what do we want to be when we grow up? The mission says kind of what we're doing, but really, if we were fully leveraged, if we were idealized as an institution, who would we be? And so what you see there in red is a big part of that, creating an environment that works for everybody, not just for students, but culture of care has to think about faculty and staff. Socioeconomic mobility, that's critically important. Our students in many cases are coming from families that are making less. In BMCC, 70% or more of our students come from families making $30,000 or less in a city where the poverty wage is somewhere in the 50,000s. So obviously that's really important for us. But those declarations by themselves, they are just declarations. So as institutions, how do we go about realizing this? There's a lot of tools that we can use. Strategic planning, that's great. That sets the priorities. That's what we need to be doing so that we can be on the same page. The financial plan, do we have the resources necessary, financial resources necessary, and how are they being deployed? Assessment and evaluation, how effective are we? The academic master plan and the strategic enrollment plan, our long-range plans, which makes the strategic plan operational by looking at the day-to-day activities that go on across the college. Predictive analytics, that's been a big one for us. We over the last 2 or 3 years, we have done a lot with predictive modeling. We now have an understanding through the pandemic of what are the factors that led students not to return from fall 2020 from spring 2020 to fall 2020. We've been looking at our overall population. We know that being in a cohort program is exceptionally important. We know that for Black and brown men, the graduation rates are 3 times higher if they're in a cohort, and the retention rates are 15 to 20 percentage points higher. Institutional reports and dashboards, we've been providing more of these, really digging down, asking harder questions, all the way to the point where recently we took a look at disaggregated student success across every section of our high enrollment gateway courses that have high D, W, F, and I rates. Institutional grants, we've had a number of Title III and Title V's. We right now have a Conexiones grant, which is focused on the success of our Hispanic and lower income populations. There are major strategic initiatives. All of these are great. All of these are useful. All of these are necessary, but they're insufficient if we're going to use these to really guide our work, because none of these are really institutional anchors. And so I think we've often, as community colleges, either sort of played around the edges with the mission and saying, well, that's who we are, so we're just going to focus on operationalizing that, or we've used the strategic plan, or some colleges have used the financial plan, which is disastrous. But the truth is, if those become your de facto business models, it's not working. When we take a look at our student outcomes, they're not working. It's not working. We don't have that framework that pulls everything together in an understanding at the college. And so that's really what we're trying to do at BMCC, and that's what's behind the idea of the community college business model. Our industry's been transformed, and that's not just over the last 2 years. We've been seeing declining public support. We've been seeing greater scrutiny, greater accountability for many years, less public support, not just financially. Our industry's been disrupted by technology. and by other factors that have forced us to change, often on the fly and often reactively. Our industry right now is going through, whether colleges realize it right now, there's a need for redesign and rebirth. If institutions don't, given what we're seeing with enrollment, given what we're seeing with consolidations across multiple states, Connecticut, Georgia come to mind, and others, our institutions are not going to be around unless we can really build out a business model that really supports our students. And as I alluded to earlier, we've got to engage and leverage administration, governance, and also leadership, the people without the official titles, the ones who are in student-facing areas, the ones who work with and interact with our students outside of the classroom as well. So there are 4 pillars to the model, and the most important one is the value proposition. Can we as institutions really look at our students and say, if you come to BMCC or you go to X community college, this is the unique value that has been provided to you based on attending the institution and getting whatever you came to get. It's about understanding the unique problems that need to be solved, the unique needs that students have, and then building out the structures, assessing, evaluating, funding them, connecting them, so that students do indeed realize that value proposition, and that's done by managing key resources. These are your human resources, your physical resources, and your intellectual. We think about the human, but are we really developing faculty and staff to be leaders and help to drive decision-making? When we think of the physical, we're thinking of it differently now that we know we can operate in hybrid space. For a place like BMCC, where our utilization rates were 98, 99%, and we had classes from 7 a.m. to 11 p.m., we have something we've never had before, which is space. So now, instead of all those years where we were growing and just trying to find a place, we actually have the time, the chance to back off and redesign our space so that it better serves the student experience. Every business has a product. Ours is not a credential, it's the educational experience of the student. And behind that is obviously in the classroom, out of the classroom. Are we looking at what's going on in the bursar's office and how people speak to students? Are we taking a look at curriculum and how it's been redesigned? Are we looking at industry advisory boards being connected? Are we looking at apprenticeships, knowing that our students need jobs and paid, and they need internships, and these have to be paid? And then the profit formula is about ensuring we have financial slack. Obviously, right now, that's an incredibly difficult conversation to have. But we need to be strategic in how we deploy our resources. It can't be year over year, you get X amount. It's almost like you've got to take a zero-based budget approach based on whatever the value proposition is, and you need to build towards it. So I'm not suggesting a corporate business model. I never would. In fact, in the book, I rail against trying to be a corporate entity, because we need to have social business models, because we are trying to build out social capital and create social benefits. That's why the community college exists. And so one of the things that I did in building out the book and just in my thinking, and this is where Dr. Munroe is incredibly helpful with his healthcare background, is I began to look at what healthcare had been doing over the years, because they're in similar positions. So Dr. Munroe, if you want to take a couple of minutes just to speak to some of the lessons you learned from healthcare business models.
Sure, thanks, Chris. Healthcare is my first profession. In fact, I started working in healthcare leadership positions in New York City back in the 80s. When HIV/AIDS was truly impacting many communities. We didn't have the lexicon, we clearly didn't have the treatment modalities that we have today. And throughout my 20-plus year healthcare experience, I've worked in a number of different settings, public institutions, faith-based healthcare institutions, was the CEO of 3 hospitals. And actually was the CEO of 2 hospitals concurrently while in Detroit. And one of the things that, lots of lessons learned from healthcare, so let me not just say one, but clearly healthcare at that time was really focused on volume. The more that we can do in terms of diagnostic tests, admissions, procedures, surgical procedures, etc., the more we would get paid. Very little was spoken to in regard to the quality or the outcomes of that product. And certainly very little was talked about in regard to the patient's experience, patient satisfaction. As an example, in 1999, the Institute of Medicine issued a report called "To Err is Human." This was a monumental report that essentially transformed healthcare in the United States. That report suggested that anywhere between 44,000 to 98,000 individuals, approximately 100,000 individuals, died in the United States in hospitals that could have been prevented, preventable deaths. And over 1 million individuals on an annual basis were injured. So the report endeavored to break the cycle of inaction regarding medical errors by advocating a comprehensive approach, which is what Chris is talking about, to improving patient safety. A tremendous amount of attention was placed on this report, both in the healthcare industry and in the public in general, because when you think about it, 100,000 preventable deaths every single year in U.S. hospitals, unacceptable. So what that ushered in was significant changes in legislation and accreditation in the way that hospitals and other healthcare institutions were reimbursed. It moved from how many widgets or how many procedures you can do to patient outcomes, patient satisfaction, readmission rates. The Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services, which is part of the Health and Human Services at the federal level, transformed how they paid healthcare institutions. Technology played a major role with the electronic medical record and all sorts of other technological advancements that have become synonymous with healthcare in the United States. They embraced innovation because they had no choice, because the Institute of Medicine's report called for a 50% reduction in medical errors in 5 years. A monumental task, which actually was the catalyst for the significant and I would say dynamic changes in healthcare that actually ultimately improve patient safety and improve the patient experience. This, I believe, is where we are as an industry, as a sector, higher education. We are at a crisis moment, and many of us are dealing with enrollment issues, retention issues, funding and financing concerns, and many other challenges that make it difficult to deliver on the promise. And so, some of the lessons learned from healthcare are clearly transferable to higher education in the respect of looking at best practices in and outside of our industry, in and outside of higher education. There are lots of lessons to be learned from healthcare and other industries that have actually gone through this transformative change 20 years ago and continue to change and evolve. And higher education has, I believe, lots of opportunity to learn from other industries, healthcare being one, as we consider what does higher education in the United States look like, especially at community colleges going forward.
Tony, can I interrupt you for a second?
Yes.
So I love your analogy here with the healthcare industry. My wife recently fell and broke her leg and had to spend a full month in the hospital and had 2 operations. And one of the things that was different from any experience we had ever had in the hospital was they immediately assigned her a patient advocate.
Yes.
That worked with her, came in to check on her every day. That was separate than the medical staff.
Yes.
And was her kind of go-between, like I was upset that the surgeon did not come out and talk with me after her surgery. And she recorded that and said, well, that's not our expectation here at our hospital. I will take your message back. Well, before long, I had that surgeon coming by to explain what happened in the surgery, which I felt like was something that should have happened in the first place. But I think that's a really good analogy about putting the patient first and how healthcare is trying to transition to that, and hopefully we do the same thing in education.
Absolutely. It is about the experience, right?
Right.
That will make the difference. And, you know, case management got a lot of attention. You mentioned patient advocate, and there are many other titles, you know, patient navigator, you know, patient advocates, patient ambassadors, community health workers, community health educators. But it was all about how do we improve the experience of the patient, which will drive better patient outcomes and reduce injuries, and ultimately, in many cases, unavoidable deaths. Thank you for that question and that statement.
Yeah, absolutely. And at BMCC, we've taken some of that health care language, thanks to, you know, Dr. Munroe's background, and my wife is an ICU nurse, so I can dabble a little bit in the language. But what we've been looking at really is, you know, this triage function. You know, are we triaging students when they first come in? Do we understand the needs, where they need to go? And the patient advocate role, that's something that we are really looking to, but we've talked about the fact that losing a student, and at BMCC, we know if they leave, they're not likely to go anywhere else in higher ed. That is the equivalent of a death from the perspective of a higher education credential. So, moving on from that to speak to a little bit more about BMCC, we were a Guided Pathways 2.0 college. And that dovetailed with an institutional redesign process that I was actually hired to do 5 years ago at BMCC. And so these played together very nicely. There was a small group of committed faculty, staff, and administrators, and I do emphasize the word small there. The reason that I do is what you'll see below about headwinds is there were some individuals who could see what was going on in the industry. They were reading the tea leaves. They were like, we can't continue to do what we've always been doing. We can't just be an institution that brings in a lot of students and doesn't create an experience that helps them to achieve their goals. So we saw that there were substantial improvements to graduation. In fact, this last year marked 6 straight years of improvements to graduation. Now, a third of our Latina students are graduating in 3 years, which is great. But when we really begin to disaggregate, and this is what you have to do to understand your student value proposition, you don't have one proposition. You have a proposition umbrella, and it's got to look different for different groups because they have different needs. And so we're taking a look and seeing at our populations that are not seeing improvements at the same level. And for us, it's primarily our Black and brown men, disturbingly low in some areas. So, you know, we got more into predictive analytics, deep analysis of what works. Again, our new strategic plan is called Taking What Works to Scale. All of this was necessary, but insufficient. And I use that word here the way that I used it when talking about the declarations. We had a lack of investment in a lot of cases at the college and headwinds. We actually were suffering from a history of plenty, if you can believe it or not. We were an institution where we didn't have to recruit, and we got students. We were in a situation where every year we were having to give money back to CUNY, because in CUNY you can't keep an endowment as traditionally understood. So you can have all of those efficiencies and gain all of those resources, and central office will take some of it and redistribute it to institutions that are not necessarily performing as well. So we had the enrollment boosts, we had significant funding, we have had a lot of Title III and Title V grants for community college, exceptionally high. So even as things began to change, and even as we started this process, institutionally there was a bit of a lack of urgency on actually making the kind of major changes. So I would say, and I'm happy to say this, I've said this to anybody who asked, it was a great process, but our final product lacked some of the necessary depth and sustainability for deep change. If I could go to, you know, an agricultural metaphor, I spent a couple of years in the Mississippi Valley State University down in the Delta, and I'm originally from North Carolina and tobacco sharecropping a family. So I understand that you can have really good soil, but if you don't till it, if you don't prepare it, nothing's gonna grow. And in a lot of cases, you don't even have soil that's ready to grow anything, and it's gotta be worked first. And so that's really what we were doing with this process. We were really working the soil and getting it ready. There were several positive changes as a result, but that foundational institutional change, like that's where we're trying to get to. That's where our journey is taking us, and that's what we're doing now. So some of the issues, and you may experience these as well, so I just want to share them. Yeah. Our identity was not rooted in the student value proposition. Just like Dr. Munroe was speaking to the fact that in healthcare it wasn't about the patient value proposition. It's not typically been with higher ed either. Take a look at our funding models. Take a look at our student outcomes. It's not. For us at BMCC, these were what we identified on a year-to-year basis as our advantages, who we were. We're the largest undergraduate college in the state. And notice I say were, because of the enrollment declines, there's now a 4-year college that's larger than us. We're located in Lower Manhattan. That's an attractive area. It's near the financial district. It's in a beautiful location. Students love to come there. It's located off the 2 and 3 train. And for those of you who have not been to New York City or not taken the MTA, you depend on those express trains, because those local trains will take you 3-4 times as long. And we would get students from Brooklyn who only have to take a trip, 15, 20 minutes to get here. Students way up in the Bronx who on a local train would be an hour and a half, all of a sudden it's 40 minutes. So that's how we sort of saw our advantages. And as you'll note, we didn't really have anything to do with any of those, not strategically. That's just, as an institution, kind of who we were. The faculty reputation for STEM, we still have that, and that does attract some students, and they notice. And they come to take some of our programs for that. But we really changed around the edges, and we had mostly sustaining innovations. And what I'm encouraging colleges to do right now is to look at nothing less than hybrid innovations, which is, yeah, there's some things you need to sustain, but they need to be disruptive as well. You need to have some disruptive innovation. Things that force you to reconsider the very values, notions, structures, policies, everything should be questionable and should be brought back to that value proposition. And we had a history of surviving crises. We lost a building in 9/11. We survived Sandy with flooding, but we survived it. And then there was an incident a couple of years ago, a terrorist incident right off of West Street, West Side Highway. And so there were indications that there were difficult times, but there really was cultural resistance to change, and that's really what we're working on. And the thing is, the way culture works is you have all kinds of cultures that impact the institutional culture. You have what's going on in society, what's going on in higher ed, what's going on within our community college world, but then inside of our college, we have faculty, students, staff, and administrators who all have different subcultures, different values, different priorities, different expectations, different ways of reading the world. Their sense-making is different, and they have subcultures that impact them. So when we talk about culture change, and this is what we're talking about, it's a mess. It's hard to do because there's so much going on. And you'll notice that the lines are dotted, and that's because it's like a cell. You've got impacts flowing up and out and all over and impacting and changing it. But then you'll notice at the bottom there's some firm lines, some solid lines, and those say emergent forces. Occasionally something so powerful happens that it gives us an opportunity and it forces us to change. For BMCC, in the next slide, Dr. Munroe will speak to many of them, but in case it was not mentioned, Dr. Munroe's been at BMCC for just over a year. He came in during the pandemic. And so talking about an emergent force and an opportunity to create new change, we've got it, and we're in that position and we're moving forward with it. So the rest of the presentation is going to be Dr. Munroe speaking to that.
Thank you, Chris. And I spent some time in Chicago where Ron Emanuel was the mayor, and he's often credited with saying never waste a crisis, right? And clearly disruption, as we've experienced it over the last year and a half or so, has presented very unique opportunities for us to reevaluate who we are, reimagine who we would like to be, and actually take advantage, leverage that disruption, as it is a force. It is a force that once you're impacted by it, you cannot stay the same. If you dial it back to high school physics or even college physics, understanding force and energy, when two objects collide, there's an exchange of energy and force, and we are clearly, as Chris pointed out on the previous slide, operating in an industry, in an environment with lots of different forces, which is causing us to reevaluate who we are, what we do, and how we do it. And this can create some degree of chaos and even anxiety, but it also can allow us to really get singularly focused on the priorities at hand. And for us, it really is retention. And when we drill down, it really is about retention of Black and brown men at BMCC, because they account for the overwhelming majority of those students that are attriting, those students that are not staying with the institution. I would also add that not only at BMCC, but across the City University of New York, where we serve 250,000 students, we saw significant growth in enrollment from about 1999, 2000 to about 2014, which was about the peak of enrollment. In the last 2 years, in the last year and a half to 2 years, that enrollment growth has been erased in the last 2 years. For us, that's millions of dollars. That's many thousands of students. And so the anxiety clearly has played a role, and the stress, as Chris has mentioned, has caused us to really redesign the institution and usher in an environment where creativity and innovation and looking for best practices that would drive risk-taking and efficiencies are absolutely essential. And it all started with our mission and our vision, which is our anchor. And Chris already mentioned the review process that we went through prior to my arrival, but to have 1,000 individuals participating in that process is monumental. And it was no small task, but what it created was this environment where we are clear about what our mission and what our role is as an institution to ensure that our students are successful. And so some of those disruptions that we've experienced over the last 20 or so months, we were at the forefront of this pandemic, which impacted us in different ways across the country at different times, different degrees of intensity. Here in New York City, and I was in New Jersey at the time, just right across the river, many people were getting sick and many were dying. And it was a very scary time for us. A disruption that we never thought of, but one that caused us to transition from in-person, almost 100% in-person delivery to fully online, remote, as many of you did, overnight. So what that showed to us clearly is that we can pivot. When there's a need, when there's a disruption, we can in fact pivot. And then around that same time, we saw a lot of civil unrest, a lot of questioning who we are as a society, concerns and demonstrations around civil rights and police brutality and racism and all kinds of other treatments of marginalized communities. Clearly, the economic crises impacted our communities on the whole, but at BMCC in particular. 70% of our students, as reported to us, either lost their job or they were looking for employment at the time of the pandemic. And many in those communities continue to be impacted negatively as a result of the pandemic. They're still looking for meaningful work. Many of them have not returned to college. Many of the jobs and the industries that they've worked in are gone, not to return. And so this disruption has actually ushered in an opportunity for us to look at how our communities are impacted by this pandemic in particular, as there's been a disproportionate impact on communities of color. And we are, as Chris pointed out, a Hispanic serving institution, one of the largest in the United States. And so this has created an opportunity for us to, next slide, Chris, to look at our business model. We're focused really on creating and sustaining pathways out of poverty and to be an engine for an equitable economic recovery. And what does that look like? And clearly, we have to look at the student value proposition, and the only way you can start that or should start that is really looking at the needs of our students. And so comprehensive needs analysis, really looking at the basic needs of our students: food, shelter, employment, economic support. We have through the Chancellor's Emergency Fund, through funds that were provided by our foundation, and also funding from the federal government. We've issued millions of dollars to students to help them with some of their financial burdens. We're looking at our cohort programming and peer support, because we know our data tells us that the cohort modeling works. Looking at key support and key resource development. Ensuring that our courses are relevant, and looking at the cultural relevance of our pedagogy and providing the professional development in that regard. Chris already mentioned the REI, which is the Race, Equity, and Inclusion Steering Committee. We have a President's Advisory on research that's going to take really hard look at what's happening as it relates to retention, and wrapping that around with the student experience and research. Reimagining our partnerships. We're having interesting conversations with major employers such as GE and Citibank, and significant discussions with very reputable foundations, including the Robin Hood Foundation and the Trinity Church Foundation. And just looking at our products, what are we offering? Is it relevant? Do we have micro-credentials and stackable credentials in place so that students can persist, and if they have to stop out, they can, but then they will have a credential. And this is really important, especially to me, because it took 14 years for me to finish my undergraduate degree. And throughout that 14 years, I never earned a credential. I didn't have anything to take back to the workforce, at that time healthcare, that was of value other than my professional work experience. But we want to ensure that our students, along their path, along their journey, along their pathway out of poverty, are accumulating and acquiring credentials, micro-credentials and stackable credentials that have significant value in the workforce. Looking at our advisory boards and ensuring that they're participating in the process of reevaluating, evaluating, and designing, redesigning our curriculum and our programs. And then finally, on the profit formula, leveraging our partnerships so that we can grow as our institution and provide for the support necessary to help our students. And looking at new workforce programming and opportunities to work with industry to ensure that our students get the training and the experience necessary so that they can step into the workforce and be productive employees. Next slide, Chris. Some very early results of this redesign. We've seen a significant uptick in our business and industry involvement. We have a major employer that is now sitting on some of our program advisory councils. We've opened a new site. It's called CUNY in the Heights. And we're being very intentional about the programming and the academic offerings that will be provided through our CUNY in the Heights location, which is in the Washington Heights inward section of Manhattan, the upper end of Manhattan, overwhelmingly Black and brown communities. We've seen expansion of our Year Up partnership. We're doing skill mapping across the entire academic curriculum. Our institution effectiveness division under Dr. Shults' leadership is redesigning what they do and how they do it. We're partnering with anyone that's willing to partner with us, including the food service industry. We've actually had meals delivered to our students. We're looking at opportunities to expand articulation agreements with our four-year institution partners. And we're looking at data that's telling us what's happening in with our high fail rates in our gateway courses, down to the section. And this has never been done before at BMCC and has been enlightening and has confirmed what many of us have suspected, that we need to do a lot more as it relates to supporting our Black and brown students, especially our male students. Next slide, Chris. So I guess Chris and I can summarize, and then we'll take some questions as time allows. As I often say, we got to take the lemons and make lemonade. In fact, that's what's in my cup right here, lemonade. It's one of my favorite drinks. And what do I mean by that? We're going to experience disruption. We're going to experience forces that impact what we do and how we do it. And it's our duty and our responsibility to turn that into, as much as we can, into a positive change. And use that to leverage the change necessary to move your organization forward. But don't do that in a silo. Do that in as inclusive a way as possible. We've learned through our experience that the more that we can engage our community, our key stakeholders, the more buy-in, the more support, the more momentum and sense of urgency we'll see across the institution. The disruption provides for opportunities for the change necessary for the right reasons, under the right conditions. So having that value proposition really, come into crystal vision is absolutely essential and can be done through this disruption. We need the leadership across the entire institution, from the administrators to faculty governance, and even at the CUNY level, because we're part of a larger university system, is absolutely essential as we try to effect the change necessary to fulfill our mission, but more importantly, to support our students in their success. And Chris can really bring it home on the last two bullets, but it is about our students. At the end of the day, it is about ensuring that our students have the experience necessary that will support their ultimate and their overall success.
Absolutely. So, just the last two, again, this is about the value proposition. You can't have a value proposition unless you really understand your students, and that's a process that takes some time. There are institutions that have been doing that for some years and gotten really good at it. An example that I use in the book and that I speak to regularly is Munroe College. And they did an intentional redesign, and what Russell shared very blatantly is we were designed for students we served 20 or 30 years ago. They were designed for the primarily white students who didn't do so well in high school. But what they had now was a majority-minority population where you had single moms, where you had populations that needed some access to English as a second language courses, where you had an increased need for jobs and connections. So they've spent the last 6 to 7 years redesigning, and they went from 16% three-year graduation rate to a 50% three-year graduation rate. Didn't happen overnight. And it's an interesting story listening to them and how they did it, but the first thing they did was figure out who are we really serving and are we built for it? And what they did, again, in the end, they determined they were not. And in some ways, Dr. Munroe had us asking these questions, and we're not built to serve some of the populations that we know we need to be serving. And that's part of what we're changing right now. I think we've had a lot of really positive changes over the last years. You saw some of those short-term outcomes. But among the biggest ones is really serving populations who we never saw as potential students. And those are the ones we need to be serving. And again, planning, assessment, and evaluation, they've been a part of driving this process. They've been central to it, but they're not sitting there just to say, are we achieving the key performance indicators in our strategic plan, which is very important. It's not just saying, well, here's how we're meeting our mission, which is very important. But again, what is the underlying reason for why we're here? It's our students, and what do they need and what value do they provide? If we can ensure that all of our major discussions, major decision making are around building out that value proposition, then I believe we can, at the end of the day, be more satisfied with the outcomes and what we're doing, because we'll be better living up to our mission, and we'll have at least made a little bit of progress in growing up to become who we want to be. So at this point, we're happy to have a discussion until the time runs out.
Thank you very much, Tony and Chris. You know, I was very much interested in seeing that your focus on your summary was about the value proposition and creating unique value for your students. We've heard other presentations in the last day and a half that continue to remind us that in the public right now, and especially in the political world, there is this concern that colleges and universities are not providing a value for our students. That graduates are coming out of colleges without skill sets and credentials that are usable in the workforce, and that too many university graduates in particular are coming out with too much debt, student debt. And that messaging that has been happening from politicians and others has impacted our potential students from really doubting whether or not they should be going to college at any level. And whenever there are other roadblocks in front of students, as you noticed at your institution, you better have something that shows them that you're going to provide them a valuable education, something that they can take with them. So that's my statement, and I applaud you for your work, because I think that what you're doing is right on. And I'll open it up for some questions here, because I know we have about 8 presidents from Ivy Tech in Indiana, and Ivy Tech is one accredited institution with 19 colleges across the state. And so they vary in size, they vary in the populations they serve. But my shout out to this group is, how are you dealing with the value proposition at your institutions? Anyone think you're doing a good job with that?
Actually, that's going to be the theme of my upcoming retreat with my campus board, is to really focus on that value proposition.
Great.
For our community, because I think that's going to be key, especially as we're competing with very different competitors than we've had in the past. When you think about nationwide and global online offerings, it really comes to that. I mean, what is the value that we're offering to our students that is going to make them choose our campus versus all of this other internet or online offerings?
Yeah, exactly. Chris, are y'all hearing that?
Yeah, I did hear. It was a little kind of fuzzy at first, but I did understand, and I did hear, and I would say that my experience with colleges, and I've been fortunate in my career. I've worked with probably 200 or more colleges from my time at AACC to Strategic Horizons Network to others, and my belief is that the student value proposition, the very concept, is antithetical to kind of how we have evolved over time as colleges. Part of it is hubris. We know best. We know what our students need. Dr. Munroe, one of his first college council meetings, this was Academic Senate. We actually had one of the individuals say, well, we know at the end of the day, faculty know what students need better than anybody else. And that's hubris. That's, it's not based in fact. And our history has been one where things have been, schedules have been designed around faculty, right? And programming around faculty requirements. We have not been doing the the heavy work that actually says, hey, we can learn from some other sector. Higher ed doesn't know everything it needs to know. We actually can work with business and industry. And when Dr. Munroe started, one of the things that I told him when he asked me a question was, historically, during my time at BMCC and well before, jobs was a 4-letter word. We didn't talk about career. We didn't talk about preparing them. And that was totally out of alignment with a student value proposition, particularly as was shared, our students who need to work, who are looking for work, who are coming from families that are not making much. When we were doing focus groups, which we've done a number of them, I continued to hear from students that their ultimate goal, it wasn't a job, it wasn't a career, it wasn't even the degree. For a lot of them, it was, I don't want to live in the same apartment for the 4th generation. That's the kind of poverty we're talking about. So what does a traditional Associates of Arts and Liberal Studies, where we don't have programming that connects you to anything, how does that meet their needs? How is that a value proposition? So these are the hard questions we have to ask ourselves. We have to be honest with ourselves. And we have to quit being so defensive and so insular. And that's part of what we fought at BMCC. And, we're getting there.
Well, Tony and Chris, we certainly appreciate you joining us by Zoom today. We're so sorry you couldn't be here in person, but understand the financial issues and COVID issues that are happening across our country right now. Hopefully next year you may be able to join us. We have recorded your session today, and it will be available for all of our attendees. And I think we have your PowerPoint presentation already. We certainly appreciate it. Folks, let's give them a big round of applause. Thank you so much, and we'll Zoom out.
Thank you. Have a great conference. Take care, everyone. Be well.
Be well, thank you.